So this is the PowerPoint presentation on the new and kind of newer DBQ for AP World History. We just went through our first year of major changes in AP World History, and here we are again doing some new revisions. But like I said at the beginning of this class, I think what you're going to find is that the newer revisions that have been done to the DBQ really don't change it all that much. It just makes it a little bit easier to teach to the students. I'm sure after this last year, you probably thought at the beginning of the year when you took a look at this new DBQ, you probably were thinking, wow, there are just so many components that go into this. But as we know from the old AP World History test, and I think from this test as well, we find that students by the end of the year really like the DBQ. And the reason why is that the DBQ provides documents for the kids to use. And because of that, they feel like there's something there to hold on to that helps them to make their arguments. The big argument that I'm going to make throughout all of this is I'm sure we know from the previous year with the DBQ, or if you're new to this, is that the DBQ really is about historical analysis and historical thinking skills. And so it's really just a matter of how do we systematize this, both for yourself as well as for your students, so that they can approach the DBQ and really feel comfortable with it. So here's the overall structure that I teach to my students for the DBQ. First off, they want to start off with contextualization, and that gets back to what we talked about at the beginning of the course with that difference between being up in the airplane over the horizon versus being down on the ground looking at the specific details. Contextualization is all about big themes and issues. The next step is the thesis, which is going to be a 2 to 3 sentence argument, and I'm going to get into that in a minute about what goes into the components of that to make it a little bit easier for your students. Then it's something that I've created called an alternate opinion or weighing statement. And there's a reason why I do this with my students. It's not required. There is, however, a point underneath the thesis point for coherency of argument. That is something that's required. This is one of the ways I have my students reach that point, the alternate opinion, and I'll explain what that is. Next up of that is the use of documents. Now, if you look at the rubric from the past, the rubric said they can have 6 of the 7 documents. That's not what I do. I have my students use all 7. I want them to get into the habit of using all 7 documents. If they make a mistake at the end of the year, they'll be okay, but I don't want them in the habit of doing that on a regular basis. I want them in the habit of doing all 7 documents. And then under the rubric, you're allowed to do 4 of the 7 documents for analysis. Again, I don't allow for that in my classroom. They have to do all 7 of the documents for analysis, and the analysis can be point of view, audience, or purpose. And then last off, the students have to do what's called outside details or historical context. If you look at the rubric will say historical context. I'm an AP US history teacher as well as AP World History. We always called this section outside details. I just think that term makes a little bit more sense, and I'll explain a little bit more about that as we get deeper into this presentation. So the introductory paragraph. I think, in the introductory paragraph, and this is the only place where we have to do this, you don't do this in the long essay, you start off with contextualization. And the reason why I put it here is that I think it's really easy for the students to understand. For the students in their English class, contextualization is the way you start off every essay. It's about 2 to 3 sentences. It's the overall themes or issues. Remember, it's when you're up in the airplane over the horizon looking at the big picture. I just think this is natural for the students, and it helps lead right into the essay. Then they're going to give a thesis, and the thesis is 2 to 3 sentences. And what I teach my students is that a thesis always has 3 components to it: the historical thinking skill, content, and impact. So the historical thinking skill is, cause and effect, change in continuity, comparison, and contrast. The content is the historical issues. And then the impact is what the major effect is. And this is the part that I think a lot of students miss most of the time. So the way I teach it to them, I'm sure this acronym is familiar, is SPRITE. They want to look for, what is the question asking for? Social, politics, religion, ideological, technological, or economic impacts. They want to find that, and they want to make sure they address that. So if they address all 3 parts, historical thinking skill, content, impact, then they're on a good path to get the thesis point. So here's an example. So you might remember this from a few years ago before the changes in the test. Compare industrialization in Japan and Russia between 1850 and 1914. So here we go. Perfect example, I think, of what we're talking about here. We've got compare. Okay, there's your historical thinking skill. The content is about Japan and Russia. And where's our SPRITE impact? Well, industrialization. So they have to do some interpretation here, and it would be economics is what they want to do. So here's what I consider to be a poor example. Japan and Russia were similar in their economic development between 1850 to 1914 because they grew their economies through industrialization. In the end, this really is just a repetition of the prompt. There's not much that's being said here that adds value to the overall prompt. But here's an excellent example. From 1850 to 1914, Japan and Russia were similar, there's your comparison, because they moved their rural populations into urban centers. However, while Russia struggled with conflicts between landowners and peasants, Japan was able to expand their sphere of influence in the Southeast Asia. So here we've got clear comparison. We have the historical thinking skill being answered. We have the historical context. And on top of that, the student goes beyond this. They provide contrast as well, so they have comparison and contrast. And it gives us that clear economic impact in both cases. In fact, it overlaps with several different issues, but the primary focus here is economics. So the alternate opinion. Okay, like I said, this is my creation, but let me explain why I do this with my students. AP US History used to do what's called holistic grading, meaning they took a look at the overall essay, and then they would say, okay, as an essay, where do we categorize this? Is it high, medium, or low? In AP World History, we've never done that. We've always done what used to be called asset grading. Now it's dimensional scoring. We're pretty familiar with this, where we give scoring for individual points for thesis and other types of skills. However, what they wanted to do in this was to give a little something to the AP US graders because holistic grading does make sense. And so what they said was, look, we're going to look at the coherency of the essay. Does the essay provide a consistent, coherent argument overall? Are there alternate viewpoints? Okay, here's where I came up with the idea of the alternate opinion. So I want my students to have a good opinion throughout their essay. But what if they were to provide a second introductory paragraph, giving an alternate opinion, then there's thesis again, and then weighing? Now, why would you want to do that? Well, for one thing, it helps with that coherency point. But here's the other thing it helps with. And this is what I think is really cool about this idea. A lot of times students will complain and say, out of the 7 documents, one just doesn't fit my argument. I'm not quite sure what to do with it. Here's the perfect thing. Take that document, find the gist of the document, use that as the alternate opinion, then use the document for analysis, and then restate your thesis. Not only are you getting that coherency point, but on top of that, you're able to address all the documents. So here's an example. Some historians argue that neither Japan nor Russia were successful in their efforts to industrialize because of their rural populations. However, both Russia and Japan were able to encourage young women in rural populations to migrate to urban centers to work in factories for extra family income. So here we have a clear alternate opinion. We have a restatement of the thesis. There's a little bit of added value with the issue of women being moved into urban centers, and then an overall weighing statement. Now, if we had a document that we couldn't fit into our overall argument, this would be a really good place to put it. So what do you do with the body paragraphs then? Well, here's my model for my students with the body paragraphs. I tell them, you got to start off with a topic sentence, and the topic sentence then will address the historical thinking skill. Students love to jump into documentary analysis right up at the top, and you really want to get them out of doing that. You want them to get into providing an overall argument, some kind of topic sentence. After that, they're going to frame their documents with outside details. So here's where I really like to use this concept that we got from AP US History, now we do in World History. You really only required to have one in the overall essay. I like to teach my students throughout the year to provide a frame, to provide 2 per paragraph. There are a number of reasons why I like this. It brings in a lot of good historical context. On top of that, students get good practice on it. If they make a mistake at the end of the year, they have other historical details to fall back on, and you're going to see it's a great way to transition into other paragraphs. So they're going to provide an outside detail, then use 2 to 3 documents. Make sure, get your students in the habit. No quoting or paraphrasing. They've got to analyze. Some teachers will argue against this. They'll say, they have their students quote, and then they'll do analysis afterwards. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, in college level classes and in AP English, they do this all the time. I don't like this for AP History because I think it gets the students into a habit that's not going to help them for AP History classes. I want them to jump right into analysis, and they can do that through point of view, audience, or purpose. So here are some examples I would use. Here's a poor example, I think, of a way you're going to approach a document. So document should be cited by author or title and then use the analysis. In this case, Count Shigenubu argues that the Meiji Empire copied Western nations in developing their industries. This pretty much is just restating what his argument is, just a paraphrased argument. But here's where we can do analysis. The document from Count Shigenubu was written to an American audience to persuade them that the Japanese were modernizing in order to attract more foreign investment for industrialization. So how do we know this is analysis? Well, 2 things. First of all, we're told the audience that's being written to, but I think even more important is that verb here. Okay, that was written to persuade. And that's where I want to get the kids into the habit, is that instead of saying argues or maintains or paraphrasing an argument, you want to have them use verbs that give a purpose to what the argument was being used for in this case. So that's the way I think that you can teach kids how to do that kind of analysis. So what about outside details? This one's tough. And I think it's even harder for us in AP World because, at least in AP US History, you're talking about 300 years, and because we get outside details from AP US History. In World, it's kind of tough because we have so much stuff that the kids could possibly access from so many time periods. But really all they need to do is provide 2 specific examples per paragraph to frame their documents. And I think it's such a good way to frame the documents, to lead into the documents, and then to transition into the next paragraph. So here's some examples. Here's a poor example. Russian leaders created greater industrial economy in the late 1800s in order to grow their economy. Okay, this is really vague. It doesn't tell me much specifically, but here's something that's more specific that we probably teach on a pretty regular basis. And I want you to notice the specifics here about how it's specific, and yet at the same time, you don't have to go into that fear of that you have to know every detail from world history. After the Russian loss in the Crimean War, the Tsar tried to implement reforms that would end serfdom and move workers into urban centers for factory work. Notice here we've got the Crimean War, which I'm sure all of us teach. Okay, the Tsars attempt to get rid of serfdom, okay, as a specific outside detail, okay, and then moving or demographic movements into urban centers. So you notice here, these are specific outside details, yet at the same time, they're not so specific. We're back to those sort of discrete examples that would be hard to memorize. So here's a body paragraph review. Here's what I have my students do. Topic sentence, outside detail to frame, analysis of document 1, analysis of document 2, and then ending of the frame with the outside detail number 2 that helps us to transition now into our next paragraph. So what about the concluding paragraph? It used to be a little bit easier this last year because even though the skill was tough to teach, at least I could always tell my students, end your essays with a synthesis. But there's no more synthesis on the test, so how are we supposed to end our essays? Well, one way to do it, and I used to do this in the past, was just to say, don't worry about a concluding paragraph. But I've kind of come to the conclusion that actually it would be good to do this for a few reasons. One, the students, it's natural for them to write a concluding paragraph. They've been taught this for so long. But there's also an advantage to doing this. The students can restate their thesis. Now, here's why that's so important. When the graders grade at the national exam, they will look for a thesis in the introduction and the conclusion. Let's just say for some reason they don't give the thesis point in their introduction. They now have restated it in the thesis. They have a second opportunity to get this, and it doesn't take long to do that. It's like 2 to 3 sentences. So get rid of the synthesis idea, move to the thesis idea. So for the rubric, again, I have to apologize. We don't know what the rubric's going to be because they are not going to be released until August. But the old rubric looks something like this. Thesis for 2 points, so 1 point for the thesis, 1 point for the coherency of the argument. Address 6 of the 7 documents, you get a point. For me, of course, I demanded my students to do all 7. Analysis of 4 documents, they get a point. Again, they have to analyze all 7 in my class. Contextualization is a point, and then outside details is a point. And of course, you probably remember from the old rubric, there would be a point for synthesis, but synthesis is out. Does that mean we can't teach synthesis? Absolutely not. For me, I'm definitely going to teach synthesis next year. I think it's such an important part of the class, and it helps the students to see the relevancy of history. But in my essays, I'm not going to have them writing synthesis anymore because I want them out of that, and I want them restating that thesis in the conclusion. So the big takeaways then for the class as far as the DBQ goes. First off, when they write to the prompt, students always have to hit 3 parts: historical thinking skill, content, and impact. So, historical thinking skill, cause and effect, change in continuity over time, comparison and contrast. Content, whatever the historical content is, and then impact of that sprite impact: social, political, religious, ideological, technological, economic. The overall essay is going to be graded for coherency, so that's why I do that alternate opinion. Documents should be analyzed, not quoted or paraphrased. Remember, our 3 tools of analysis that we want the students to have would be audience, point of view, and purpose. And there's no longer any synthesis. Instead, we're having them do a restatement of the thesis. So again, I think what's great about the DBQ, what's tough about it is that there are so many different components. What's great about it is once they get the system down on how to attack it, they've got the documents to inspire them. And I think that really provides a comfort level for them. And it's just a great way to teach them all of these historical thinking skills.